dietary lipids and breakdown. Sorry, so we started talking about breakdown of dietary lipids. Told you that most textbooks say that it actually starts in the small intestine. So for newborns, actually, it starts sooner. It starts in your mouth and in your stomach, actually, because there are two types of lipases that start breaking down lipids. But then, as we grow up, this becomes less important, and lipid degradation primarily happens in the small intestine. So what happens here is that as your food content reaches your small intestine, an enzyme peptide hormone cholecystokinin is secreted, and this stimulates actually the pancreas to secrete enzymes, and also bicarbonate is being secreted to neutralize the acidic stomach content that reaches at this point the intestine. And then I told you that the liver actually produces bile salts, natural detergents, which are stored in the gallbladder, and they are also secreted and help to emulsify lipids so that the pancreatic or intestinal lipase, it's also called, that works together in a one-to-one ratio with co-lipase, can break down our fats. So the co-lipase actually helps to anchor the intestinal lipase at these micelles so that the enzyme can actually work at this interface between the more aqueous environment and the lipid fat droplets. So what happens next is that the breakdown products of this enzymatic activity are actually, interestingly enough, taken up by the intestinal mucosa, so the cells of the intestine, okay, and are converted into triacylglycerols again. Okay. And in the intestinal mucosa, these lipids are incorporated into aggregates between lipids and proteins that we refer to as lipoproteins, and they're incorporated in the intestine into a particular type of lipoproteins called chylomicrons. And chylomicrons, just like other lipoproteins that we're going to talk about in a moment, are, as I said, aggregates that contain varying degrees, varying concentrations or amounts of lipids and proteins respectively. So here are chylomicrons, which are actually the least dense lipoproteins and the largest lipoproteins. We'll see that lipoproteins are actually classified based on their density, and the density is determined by the ratio of proteins compared to lipids, because lipids are less dense, they're lighter, okay, and proteins are somewhat heavier. I'll give you some numbers in a moment. And the more lipids these aggregates, these conjugates contain, the less dense they are. Okay, and the more protein components they contain, the denser they are, the heavier they are. And this also plays a role in the nomenclature of these compounds. So what we're dealing with at the moment are those that are produced or assembled in the intestinal mucosa that then will transport actually dietary lipids that we've taken up with our food throughout our body. And we'll see a schematic overview of this in a moment. So this is just a schematic representation of such a chylomicron. I think you can also look at it as a schematic representation of lipoproteins in general. So we have a very hydrophobic core that, especially in the case of these chylomicrons, contains a lot of triacylglycerols and also cholesterol esters. So cholesterol is esterified with the help of a certain type of enzyme, a certain type of transferase, is linked to fatty acids. And then we see that this interior core is actually surrounded by a lipid monolayer that is formed of phospholipids or biphospholipids and also cholesterol. So relatively similar to our, for example, plasma membrane, which would be formed by bilayers, but here we are really talking about a monolayer because the interior here is not aqueous but is hydrophobic, is lipids, okay? And then we have in these structures embedded also protein components, which, if we took away the lipids would just be called apolipoproteins. Okay, so these are the protein components. Apo, as you may have heard in other classes, may have heard before, is anything typically a protein that lacks, for example, cofactor. Apo enzyme lacks a particular cofactor it needs for its activity. If we add this, we can refer to the holo enzyme, contains everything. Here, the nomenclature is similar. The protein component, if we just took away all the lipids here, would be referred to as apolipoproteins. Okay, but here, the apolipoproteins are part of these lipoproteins. Forgive me when I occasionally pronounce it lipoprotein, because it's just so engraved in my head from my German background, okay, my German pronunciation, but lipoproteins, okay, but then it's lipids, so it's very confusing. So I try to say lipoproteins and keep the pronunciation right, okay. So there are a bunch of different apolipoproteins that are added to the different types of lipoproteins. I'm not going into much detail here. I just added those that are added to the chylomicrons. Interesting enough, this one called B48 is supposedly added in the intestinal mucosa, while others like C2 and E actually added in the plasma. Now these chylomicrons are then transported throughout our body, as we'll see in a moment in this overview, in the lymph system and also in the bloodstream. But before we take a look at this overview, here is a table that summarizes some features of the different classes of human lipoproteins. So I added this density. I tried to find it somewhere. I think I did. Well, I just said it must be smaller than 0.95. So these are the least dense lipoproteins, and they are somewhere around 0.95 or less in density, expressed in grams per milliliter. So as I said, the density of these lipoproteins is determined by the content or the ratio of lipids versus proteins. So proteins, we can assume, typically have a density that is greater 1.3 grams per milliliter, and lipids have about, that was quite difficult to find actually, 0.9 grams per milliliter or such. So the more lipids we have, the less dense they are, the more protein we have, the denser they are. So if we look at chylomicrons, they don't contain a lot of proteins, but phospholipids, a little bit of free cholesterol, cholesterol esters, and then a lot of triacylglycerols. Okay, so the dietary lipids that we take up with our food. And then we see that there are others. VLDL stands for very low density lipoproteins, LDL stands for low density lipoproteins, and HDL stands for high density lipoproteins. And we see that as we increase density here, which is shown in this column, we increase the protein content of these lipoproteins, and then we have different compositions with regard to the lipids that are contained in these lipoproteins. Okay, so I said that these lipoproteins also differ with regard to their size. Note that the magnification here is different for chylomicrons, so it's 3 times less magnified compared to the other lipoproteins, excuse me. So they are, if we had the same magnification, they would actually be 3 times larger, so they are relatively huge compared to the other lipoproteins. Very low density lipoproteins have about 28 to 70 nanometers diameter, and then they get smaller. Okay, low density lipoproteins and high density lipoproteins. So let's take a look at this overview. I'll walk you through it. So chylomicrons are assembled, let's say, the assembly starts in the intestinal mucosa, and then we add some more apolipoproteins to them, and then they're transported in the lymph system and the bloodstream to one of these apolipoproteins, C2, can actually activate a lipase called lipoprotein lipase in certain target tissues like memories, heart or skeletal muscle and adipose tissue, and there these lipoproteins, chylomicrons, will actually bind to these receptors transiently and activate these lipoprotein lipase, and the lipoprotein lipase will then cleave ester bonds between the fatty acids and our glycerol backbones, and fatty acids will actually be taken up by these tissues and then can be utilized for energy production or can be stored, okay, in the form of fats again. So we remove then, of course, triacylglycerols, and the remnants of these chylomicrons are transported back into the liver. So if the supply of lipids that exceeds what we need at the moment, the liver actually repackages these lipids, adds apolipoproteins of certain types again, and produces so-called very low density lipoproteins. Okay. And these, again, are sent throughout the system. We can remove free fatty acids. We reduce the content of triacylglycerols, and we form actually remnants of these very low density lipoproteins that can also be called intermediate density lipoproteins. And these can be further converted into low density lipoproteins. Okay. Now if we look at the composition of these, we see that low density lipoproteins actually have much less triacylglycerols, much less fat, because fat has been removed, okay? And we have, relatively speaking, quite a bit more of cholesterol, free cholesterol, and also cholesterol esters. And as you may know, elevated cholesterol levels in your bloodstream have been associated with atherosclerosis, so heart attacks and strokes. And for that reason, low density lipoprotein has been named bad cholesterol. So when you hear the name bad cholesterol, it actually does not refer to cholesterol itself, but to these lipoproteins that contain a lot of cholesterol. On the other hand, we see a different type here, the HDL, the fourth type here of our lipoproteins shown here, which actually can be, precursors can be synthesized, sorry, wrong direction, can be synthesized in the liver and then can transport cholesterol from extrahepatic tissues, so extrahepatic, remember, meaning tissues other than the liver, back to the liver. Okay. So since they remove pretty much cholesterol from our system, transport it back to the liver, HDL, for that reason, has been named good cholesterol. Okay. Again, it's not cholesterol itself, okay, but it's a lipoprotein. It has a certain function in our body. Okay, so I pretty much discussed what we see here on the right side of the slide already. So we have this lipoprotein lipase in certain tissues that can remove fatty acids from triacylglycerols. They are then taken up by these cells, and again, they can be utilized for energy production, or could in adipose tissue also be esterified with glycerol again to form triacylglycerols. But we'll talk about the process, how this degradation of fatty acids works in order to produce energy in a moment. First, what we're going to look at is what happens to storage lipids. So if we have fat stored in adipose tissue and our body realizes that energy is needed, certain types of hormones are actually secreted. So this is glucagon, which is very important. Glucagon signals an energy insufficient state, okay? And glucagon is produced by the alpha cells of pancreas and is then sent in the bloodstream to target tissues, among others, adipose cells. Okay? And glucagon can then bind to certain membrane-bound receptors, glucagon receptor, which is coupled to a G protein, and G protein actually activates then also membrane-bound or associated enzyme called adenylyl cyclase. Adenylyl cyclase converts ATP into cyclic AMP, And cyclic AMP concentrations intracellularly then increase, and CAMP activates an enzyme that we can call CAMP-dependent protein kinase, also known as protein kinase A. And this protein kinase A actually phosphorylates a bunch of targets. Among others, a lipase that can cleave triacylglycerols and therefore is called triacylglycerol lipase. And then here in our adipose cells cleaves the ester bonds between our glycerol backbone and our fatty acids and releases fatty acids. Okay. Now the fatty acids then are transported out of the cell into the bloodstream, where they cannot be transported as free fatty acids because they are too hydrophobic, but they're transported bound to human serum albumin. Okay, and human serum albumin can bind all kinds of hydrophobic acids, among others fatty acids also, and one molecule of human serum albumin, which has a molecular weight of about 67 kilodaltons or so, can bind up to 10 fatty acids and transport the fatty acids in our bloodstream, again, to target tissues like muscle cells that need these fatty acids for energy production. Here the fatty acids are transported, are taken up by a transporter into the cells and are broken down for energy production. And again, we'll talk about how this happens in a moment. Now, I just mentioned glucagon. The same effect has another enzyme that you may know under the name epinephrine or adrenaline, which is secreted by the adrenal medulla. Okay, it pretty much has the same effect, can bind to specific receptors in target tissues and target cells like adipocytes, and can have here in this case pretty much the same effect that we just discussed for glucagon. Okay, so here is the cyclic AMP that increases in concentration when we have the binding of glucagon or epinephrine to these membrane-bound receptors. It's produced by adenylyl cyclase. Now, for the longest time, actually, textbooks would just stop here with the discussion and would say, okay, the increased degradation of triacylglycerols upon hormonal secretion is simply based on activation of this triacylglycerol lipase, but then it was found that overall secretion of hormones increases the overall breakdown of triacylglycerols by a factor of about 50 or so. But then someone found that the activity of the enzyme is actually just increased by a factor of 2 or 3. So something else has to happen. And the something else is actually shown on the next slide, which I think is more similar to what we found nowadays in the textbook also. And it shows the activation of triacylglycerol lipase, which is called here hormone-sensitive lipase. But it also shows that this protein kinase A, again, this is CAMP-dependent protein kinase, which is increased in activity when CAMP levels rise, can also phosphorylate a protein that actually lines the surface of the lipid droplets in which our triacylglycerols are stored. And this protein is called perilipin. And perilipin actually, when it's phosphorylated, undergoes a conformational change and makes these lipid droplets more accessible to hormone-sensitive lipase, so it makes it easier for the enzyme to actually cleave our triacylglycerols and release free fatty acids. Okay, so this together, the activation of the enzyme, the phosphorylation of the perilipin, the increased accessibility of our triacylglycerols actually has a increased breakdown of triacylglycerols by a factor of about 50. Okay, so let's talk about how fatty acids are actually utilized for energy production then in tissues like muscle cells. And here, just a second. And here your textbooks are, how should I phrase this? Are not overly specific, usually, because most textbooks and most other sources will just say that degradation of fatty acids actually occurs in the mitochondrial matrix, which is true, and the mitochondrial matrix is probably of greatest importance overall, I guess, but it's not the whole truth, and I'll tell you a little bit more about this later. But not only the triacylglycerols that are released in adipose tissues or come from dietary sources can be utilized for energy production. Also the glycerol actually that is released when we cleave the ester bonds to our fatty acids can be utilized for energy production. This can happen primarily in the liver, where glycerol actually is phosphorylated by a kinase, glycerol kinase, to form the glycerol 3-phosphate. Now this glycerol 3-phosphate can also be utilized for the production of fats again in the liver, also to a certain extent in kidneys, I suppose. But what can also happen here to our 3-carbon backbone is that we oxidize the hydroxyl group to a ketone with the help of an dehydrogenase, glycerol 3-phosphate dehydrogenase. NAD plus is the cofactor here, we produce NADH, and then the dihydroxyacetone phosphate, which we are familiar with, can be converted by triose phosphate isomerase to glyceraldehyde 3-phosphate and can be further broken down or converted actually in the payoff phase of glycolysis for energy production. Okay, so also the glycerol backbone can be utilized for energy production. Okay, so let's take a look at fatty acid degradation. So for the time being, we'll just assume that this degradation of fatty acids occurs in the mitochondrial matrix, and I'll tell you more about this when we're done with this discussion. Now, the fatty acids now have been taken up by our cells, let's say muscle cells. They are in the cytosol, but then, as I just said, degradation of these fatty acids actually happens, say, primarily in the mitochondrial matrix. This actually represents our first problem because there is no transporter that would transport free fatty acids across the inner mitochondrial membrane. So this inner mitochondrial membrane, I think you know by now, is a real problem with regard to transporting molecules back and forth. The same is true also for fatty acids. So fatty acids are not simply transported back and forth, and they have to be activated actually for degradation. Okay? And the activation of the fatty acids for degradation happens by linking them to coenzyme A. Remember coenzyme A, cofactor we discussed previously when we talked about production of acetyl-CoA. And I told you that coenzyme A can bind to carboxylic acids like acetic acid to form acetyl-CoA, but also to fatty acids. It's important for transporting fatty acids. And in order to activate, we also know that this is a thioester bond that is formed to coenzyme A. So this is the activated form of our fatty acids, fatty acyl-CoAs. Okay, and we have to produce them, and then we have to transport these acyl-CoAs across the inner mitochondrial membrane. So these are the two challenges that we are facing. We need to activate the fatty acids, okay, link them to coenzyme A upon taking them up to the cytosol, and then they need to be transported to the mitochondria. You may think, okay, that's relatively straightforward. Yes, in a way it is, but again, it's not that easy. So let's first take a look at the activation of the fatty acids. So we link them to coenzyme A to form these fatty acyl-CoAs. Okay? And this actually happens at the outer side of the outer mitochondrial membrane, actually. Okay? And there are isozymes of an enzyme called fatty acyl-CoA synthetase that can link fatty acids to coenzyme A. So the name synthetase here should tell you already something, namely it utilizes, consumes ATP. Okay, and this shouldn't come as a surprise because we form an energy-rich thioester bond between coenzyme A and the fatty acids. So it shouldn't come as a surprise that we actually consume energy we consume energy in the form of ATP. So what the enzyme does first is that it utilizes a molecule of ATP, adenosine triphosphate, and links pretty much the AMP portion of that, okay, adenosine monophosphate, here to our fatty acid. So we have a bond between our carboxylic acid and one of the phosphoric acids. So this is mixed anhydride, okay, energy rich. And we release these two phosphates, which are still linked to each other and are referred to as pyrophosphate. Pyrophosphate is usually immediately cleaved by an omnipresent enzyme called inorganic pyrophosphatase. So we also break this phosphoanhydride bond in our pyrophosphate. Now, what the enzyme then does is that it has. Oh, I should tell you what this process is called when we link something to an AMP. It's called an adenylation. I'm not sure if you've heard this in 472 yet, but we adenylate here the fatty acid. We form an energy-rich bond. Okay, adenylation and similar reactions are often used to make a functional group more reactive. Okay, and here we actually have a nucleophilic attack of the thiol of coenzyme A. Remember that we have the thiol, one end of our coenzyme A. You can attack this partially positive carbon here, cleave off AMP, okay, and form a conjugate between the fatty acid and that we actually, at this point, when we release the AMP, have consumed two ATP equivalents, two energy-rich bonds, because we have converted ATP into AMP. Okay, and we've also cleaved our pyrophosphate here. So just the activation of a fatty acid is actually relatively cost-intensive. And we will see later the overall energy yield that we have when we break down an average fatty acid. To calculate how many ATP equivalents we can get from breaking down a fatty acid, we have to take into account this activation, which costs us 2 ATP equivalents. So at this point, we have in the outer mitochondrial membrane produced a fatty acyl-CoA. Okay, always remember what acyl means. It's just a derivative of carboxylic acid. Here it's linked to coenzyme A. And now we want to transport this fatty acyl-CoA across the inner mitochondrial membrane. But as so often, there is no dedicated transporter that would allow us to transport this fatty acyl-CoA directly across the inner mitochondrial membrane. Okay, so what do we have to do? We have to convert it into something, at least transiently, that can be transported. This happens with the help of, again, a bunch of isozymes that are located first at the outer face of the inner mitochondrial membrane. So remember, you have two membranes. One is the outer membrane, one is the inner membrane. The outer membrane has porins, the inner membrane doesn't have a dedicated transporter now, okay, for our fatty acyl-CoAs. But it has two faces, one facing the intermembrane space, so that would be here, and the other one facing the mitochondrial matrix. We want to transport these fatty acyl-CoAs ideally across this barrier. Okay. So now we have these enzymes here, this side of the inner mitochondrial membrane, and they are a class of enzymes called carnitine acyltransferase A1, excuse me. And what they can do is that they can transfer the fatty acid from our CoA conjugate to this molecule, which is called carnitine. So carnitine actually is a derivative of lysine, never mind, but it's a trimethylated aminohydroxybutyrate. If you look at the structure, it becomes clear. Butyrate would mean we have a fatty acid, or we can call it fatty acid already with 4 carbons. A short fatty acid, carboxylic acid with 4 carbons, 1, 2, 3, 4, which at the other end has an amine, okay? It's aminobutyrate, but then we have the amine methylated with 3 methyl groups. So we can call it trimethyl amino butyrate, but then we have a hydroxyl group in this carbon, third carbon here, 1, 2, 3. And therefore we can refer to this structure as a 4, okay, because that's where we have the amino group. Trimethyl, 1, 2, 3, amino, 3, 1, 2, 3, hydroxy, butyrate. And this is carnitine. And carnitine is important actually to help us transport fatty acids into the mitochondrial matrix. So we form now from this conjugate here between our fatty acid and coenzyme A, take the fatty acid residue and link it via an ester bond here to carnitine to form an acyl carnitine. Remember, acyl again, derivative of carboxylic acid, now it's linked to carnitine. And then there is a transporter here in the inner mitochondrial membrane called acyl carnitine / carnitine transporter, because it can transport these acyl carnitine conjugates across the inner mitochondrial membrane. And then on the other side of the inner mitochondrial membrane, so the one facing the matrix, we have again a bunch of isozymes called carnitine acyltransferase 2, which can then take the fatty acid again and transfer it back to a coenzyme A. Okay, and release carnitine, which can be transported back to the other side. And so we have a net transport of a fatty acyl-CoA across the inner mitochondrial membrane, but this is not really a direct transport, it's more like a kind of I'm not sure if we would refer to this as a shuttle system. We'll talk about shuttle systems later this semester. But it's not a direct transport. But the net effect is that we have now a fatty acyl-CoA, an activated fatty acid in the mitochondrial matrix. Okay, understood? So activation is necessary, and then this kind of detour here to transport the activated fatty acid into the mitochondrial matrix. Now what happens next is that in the mitochondrial matrix we break down fatty acids that have been transported into the mitochondrial membrane by chopping off 2 carbon units and form acetyl-CoA. So this is schematically shown here for, I think, palmitic acid. In reality, situation may be a bit more complex, but okay, let's assume we have palmitic acid in the mitochondrial matrix, and it's broken down in a process called beta oxidation. And we'll see why it's called beta oxidation in a moment. But what beta oxidation does is that it chops off 2 carbon units, acetic acid residues really, that are linked to coenzyme A. So what we form is acetyl-CoA, the molecule that we can channel acid cycle. Okay, we've talked about the citric acid cycle again. I told you that not only carbohydrates can serve as a source of acetyl-CoA, but also lipids and certain proteins. And here we have it. If we chop up fatty acid, we produce acetyl-CoA, can be channeled to the citric acid cycle. We produce quite a bit of NADH, FADH2, and 1 ATP equivalent for each molecule of acetyl-CoA that go through the citric acid cycle. And then I told you that the NADH and the FADH2 can actually be utilized in cellular respiration, in electron transport, coupled to oxidative phosphorylation to produce more ATP. Okay? So, this is something, as I said before, that we're going to discuss once we are finished with our discussion of catabolism of proteins also, which follows here our discussion of lipid catabolism. What we're focusing on now is beta oxidation of fatty acids as occurs in mitochondrial matrix. So, we have our activated fatty acid, and we do this here using palmitic acid or palmitoyl-CoA as an example. Remember, we have to activate fatty acid by linking it to coenzyme A, and now we have it in the mitochondrial matrix. Now this process is called beta oxidation because we oxidize, simple enough, we oxidize the beta carbon here of our fatty acid, of our activated fatty acid. So if we look at this structure here, the alpha carbon would be the one following our functional group, which here is our carboxylic acid linked via thioester bond to coenzyme A, and the beta carbon is this one. Okay. Now if you look down here, we see that, okay, alpha beta in this process here called beta oxidation, we have introduced at this beta position a ketone. Okay, so we've oxidized this carbon, and that's why it's called beta oxidation. And we see that then from this structure we cleave off a coenzyme A, producing a 2-carbon unit, acetyl-CoA, that is channeled into the citric acid cycle, and we produce a fatty acyl-CoA that is shortened by 2 carbons. Okay? And in order to break down a fatty acid like the 16-carbon long palmitic acid, we would have to go through this beta oxidation a couple of times, depending on the length, okay, of the fatty acid. So if we have a 16-carbon long palmitic acid, or palmitoyl-CoA, how often would we have to go through this beta oxidation process to produce just acetyl-CoAs? How many acetyl-CoAs would we produce? We have 16 carbons.
8.
Are you sure? 8? Sounds doubtful. 16 carbons, you produce 2 carbon units. How many do you have?
8.
8. Of course 8. Okay. So how often do you have to go through this process? How many bonds do you have to cleave to produce 8 units? Seven times, of course. Okay, you one at the end, yeah. Chop, 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 7 times, and you produce 8 compounds. So if you have 2 units to produce, or let's say 4 carbons to produce two carbon units, you would have to break 1 bond, right? Okay, so here we have 8 units to produce, so we have to go through this 7 times. And that will be important to remember when we look at the overall energetics of these processes. Okay, so keep that in mind. Okay, so let's go through this step by step now that we hopefully have an understanding of what we want to accomplish here in this beta oxidation. We have to find a way to introduce a ketone at this carbon. And in biochemistry, this is typically done, necessarily always, but typically done by introducing an oxygen first in the form of a hydroxyl group, okay? So I'm actually doing it the other way around almost. Introducing a hydroxyl group which can easily be oxidized, as we know, with the help of a dehydrogenase. But how do we actually introduce a hydroxyl group? We've learned this already when we talk about the citric acid cycle, the last couple of steps in the citric acid cycle, because we actually learned how we can form malate from fumarate. Okay, so we produced fumarate from succinate, if you remember that, by introducing a double bond. So we utilized a dehydrogenase that had FAD as a cofactor, you may remember that, produced a trans double bond, do that here, and then we just added water. Okay, so we had, remember, we had fumarate hydratase in the citric acid cycle that introduced a hydroxyl group to form malate. Here we have an hydratase also that can add water in the form of a hydroxide ion at the beta carbon, and then a proton here at the alpha carbon, to introduce this group that we can then oxidize to a ketone. Okay. So now let's do it in the right order. The first step, okay, but I tried to make you understand how nature works here, and how this is, from a chemical point of view, pretty much identical to the chemistry that is utilized in the citric acid cycle. So, what we do is we use a dehydrogenase using FAD. It's called acyl-CoA dehydrogenase, appropriately enough, to introduce this trans double bond. Then we can refer to this as a trans delta 2 ennyl CoA. Why trans delta 2? Because our trans double bond is between carbons 2 and 3 here. Ennyl, because we have a double bond here and it's a derivative of fatty acid. The enzyme that then introduces our hydroxyl group is called a hydratase, but because this is the substrate, we can call it ennyl-CoA hydratase, and we produce hydroxyl group at the beta carbon. Now, this carbon is actually chiral, and the product, or the intermediate that is formed here, is actually the L enantiomer. So, but the hydroxyl group is at the beta carbon, so we can call it beta hydroxy acyl fatty acid CoA. It's the L enantiomer, so the complete name would be L beta hydroxy acyl CoA. Now this is being oxidized, as I said before, with the help of an appropriate dehydrogenase. Why not call it beta hydroxy acyl CoA dehydrogenase, which utilizes NAD+ as a cofactor. We produce NADH. We have introduced our ketone now, so why not call it beta keto acyl CoA, which is then cleaved. Okay, and there's an enzyme that has different names. I usually call it thiolase. Okay, you can also call it acyl CoA acetyltransferase. But what it does is that it actually catalyzes a nucleophilic attack of the thiol of coenzyme A onto this beta carbon. We form a new derivative of our remaining fatty acid with a new molecule of coenzyme A. This is this one here. And we release acetyl-CoA. So it's actually not particularly challenging here, especially if you remember the chemistry that we used in the last couple of steps in the citric acid cycle. Okay? So there's a great analogy with regard to the chemistry that is used here. Hope you see that. So again, in order to further break this now 14 carbon long fatty acid down, we would have to go through this a couple more times. I'm not going to talk about this in detail, of course, because you should have understood the overall principle. Okay, what I want to point out, and again, this is something that we want to keep in mind when we look at the overall energetics of these processes, is that not only the acetyl-CoA that is produced here in beta oxidation in this channel into the citric acid cycle produces energy in the form of ATP equivalent, 3 NADH molecules, 1 FADH2 molecule, but also beta oxidation itself has two steps that produces energy-rich electron carriers in the form of FADH2 here and NADH here. And also these electron carriers can be utilized in electron transport and oxidative phosphorylation for the production of more ATP. So how does the FADH2 that is produced here actually, or the electrons coupled to this FADH2, reach the electron transport chain that's shown here on this slide? Never mind, we're going to talk about the electron transport chain in more detail soon. But there is a which I refer to as a mobile electron carrier, which is a part of the electron transport chain, which is shown here as Q, it's ubiquinone, and this can take up electrons that stem from the degradation of fatty acids. So here's our dehydrogenase that produces FADH2, and then via the so-called electron transferring flavoprotein, ETF, which also has an FAD, we transfer the electrons here that are linked to first or dehydrogenase first to this protein, and from there to another protein that also has an FAD, which is reduced to an FADH2, and it also has an iron sulfur cluster, and from the iron sulfur cluster, electrons, single electrons actually at the time, are transferred then to this coenzyme Q or ubiquinone, which is shown as Q here. Okay, so. But we'll talk about this kind of stuff again when we talk about the electron transport chain. Okay, so remember the acetyl-CoA is produced, is channeled to the citric acid cycle. We produce NADH in 3 steps in the citric acid cycle, FADH2 in 1 step, and then we produce 1 ATP equivalent here in the succinyl-CoA synthetase reaction. Okay. So let's assume that this is what happens to fatty acids that have an even number of carbons, like 16, 18, 20, and so on. Okay. But what happens if we have an odd number of carbons in the fatty acid? That's actually shown on this slide. So we chop up the fatty acid as discussed in beta oxidation by releasing 2 carbon units in the form of acetyl-CoA until we've chopped up pretty much the whole fatty acid, and at the end we are left with a propionic acid linked to coenzyme A. So we have a propionyl-CoA. Now the propionyl-CoA is actually converted into succinyl-CoA and channeled to the citric acid cycle. So what we do is, rather than removing a 1 carbon unit of the 3 carbon propionic acid, is we add another carbon to form a 4 carbon unit. Okay? But it's not succinyl-CoA that is produced immediately. We have these 3-step, 1, 2, 3-step process that converts propionyl-CoA into succinyl-CoA. Now, doesn't look like a lot here, but actually it's not quite that straightforward what is happening here. So the first step is relatively easy to understand. We have a carboxylation reaction. Remember, carboxylates typically require biotin as a cofactor and also consume ATP. So I talked about pyruvate carboxylase last time, I think. Now similarly, we can utilize a carboxylase, which is here called propionyl-CoA carboxylase, to introduce a carboxyl group into our propionic acid to form this structure, okay, linked to coenzyme A. And this structure here is called methylmalonyl-CoA. Okay. So do you have any idea why this structure here, this one, would be called methylmalonyl or methylmalonic acid, malonate, cyanide form? Yes, please.
And that's malonic acid with the 2 carboxylic acids.
Okay, what? Absolutely right, but just say it again. What exactly is malonic acid?
The 2 carboxylic acids with 1 carbon in the middle.
Exactly. So it's a, thank you. It's a dicarboxylic acid with 3 carbons. Remember when we talked about the citric acid cycle, I told you that you should familiarize yourself with the nomenclature of simple dicarboxylic acids. This one we haven't seen yet, but I told you that if we have just 2 carbons, it's oxalic acid. If we have 3 carbons, it's malonic acid. Okay? So here we have malonic acid actually, and it's methylated. It has another methyl group here, and therefore we can call it methylmalonyl-CoA. Excellent, thank you. Now this is what is formed here in this carboxylation reaction, a chiral molecule. It happens to be the D enantiomer that is formed here, which is changed by an isomerase, which is here called an epimerase, to L-methylmalonyl-CoA. So same thing, dicarboxylic acid with 3 carbons was methylated, linked to coenzyme A. So far so good, nothing too strange I guess. But then what happens is that we switch the positions of this blue functionality and the red hydrogen here, okay, with the help of an enzyme called methylmalonyl-CoA mutase. Remember, mutases catalyze intramolecular group transfers, okay? Nothing special about this, but this enzyme is actually quite interesting because it contains vitamin B12, cobalamin. Okay. Cobalamin is a relatively complex structure, which is shown here, which is based on the so-called Corrin ring system, which has some resemblance with the heme group, okay, which you know from hemoglobin, for example. Structurally quite similar. Okay, we also have a tetrapyrrole ring system, and then we have a central, it's based on a tetrapyrrole here, and we have a central ion. Remember, in hemoglobin, this central ion would be iron. Now here it's not iron, but it's a trace element cobalt. Okay, so that makes this thing quite interesting by itself. Now if we take a closer look at this structure, we see that the cobalt, just like the iron in heme has 6 coordination sites. 4 are occupied by our ring nitrogens, just like we have it in heme. Remember, in heme, we could bind actually oxygen to one of these remaining coordination sites, and the other one would be occupied by a histidine imidazole nitrogen. Now here the situation is a little bit different because this cobalt, let's go down here first, interacts also with a nitrogen. Okay, here's some sort of similarity to heme, let's say. I don't want to overstress this. But it's actually coming from a nucleotide that is neither purine nor a pyrimidine nucleotide. Okay, remember what the nucleotide has to have: a nitrogenous base, a sugar, and a phosphate. So here our nitrogenous base is actually this structure, which we can refer to as a dimethyl benzimidazole ring. Okay, sounds more complicated than it is. It's a dimethylated benzene derivative which has fused here to it a imidazole ring, and therefore we can refer to the dimethyl benzimidazole. Okay, that's our nitrogenous base, which is linked to a ribose, here's our sugar, linked to a phosphate. So therefore this is a nucleotide that we can refer to as a dimethyl benzimidazole ribonucleotide. Now this is linked via this amino isopropanol to one position here in our Corrin ring system, never mind. So this is already quite interesting. But then what is really pretty cool is that we have in our 6 coordination site a deoxyadenosine. So this is adenosine, so it's a nucleoside. Remember what the difference is between a nucleotide and a nucleoside. Nucleotide contains phosphate, nucleoside not. Just has a nitrogenous base. Adenine, okay. You would also have an AMP, for example, okay, but this is just the adenosine. Here is our sugar, but we see that at the carbon number 5, where we usually have hydroxyl group and ribose, we do not have an oxygen here. So therefore it's a 5' deoxy adenosine that we are dealing with here. And what the cool part really is that it is this carbon that occupies our 6 coordination site here about our cobalt. So we have a direct metal carbon bond here, which is, I mean, if you ask Dr. Hosmani, I guess, this is a nice example of a direct metal carbon bond here that occurs in nature. Okay, it's quite unusual. So this is actually the cofactor that we have here in this enzyme that converts here our L-methylmalonyl-CoA to succinyl-CoA, this mutase. Now there is a different variety of vitamin B12 where we have not this deoxyadenosine group here, but a methyl group here. So vitamin B12 is actually utilized also for other reactions, and I think we'll talk about at least one more. Okay, so this is vitamin B12. It's a vitamin because you have to take it up with your diet, and that's probably the vitamin that if you are a vegetarian, you might have deficiency of, okay, because it's contained primarily in meat. However, if you eat sauerkraut, for example, it's also contained in that, and I think also in certain seeds. Okay, but if you're a vegetarian, not sure who is, you may be familiar with this. Okay, so you have to watch out for vitamin B12 deficiency. Okay, so these are the processes that help us to break down odd-numbered fatty acids. How about unsaturated fatty acids, which we also have and take up with our diet? If we only have monounsaturated fatty acids, it's a pretty straightforward process. We first chop up the fatty acid and release acetyl-CoA units until the point where we have our cis double bond here. Remember, naturally occurring fatty acids have cis double bonds. Here I told you that our first double bond usually occurs after carbon 9, between carbon 9 and 10. So we can actually, if we break down such a monounsaturated fatty acid, release first 3 acetyl-CoA units until we reach a point where we are dealing with a cis delta 3 fatty acid. Okay, 1, 2, 3. Here's our double bond. That's not what our enzymes can deal with. That actually perform beta oxidation. What we need is a trans delta 2 double bond but this can easily be achieved by simply isomerizing here the cis delta 3 to trans delta 2, and then we can continue with beta oxidation. And there's an isomerase, anyl-CoA isomerase that can do that. So it's actually not particularly challenging. If we have polyunsaturated fatty acids, it's a little bit more complex, but in principle we do the same kind of stuff. We first chop up the fatty acids. Here it's shown for linoleic acid. Our first double bond is between 9 and 10, carbons 9 and 10. So we can release 3 acetyl-CoAs again. Then we have 2 double bonds, both are cis double bonds. Okay, we can isomerize, just as we did previously, this first one to a trans delta 2 double bond, perform one more cycle of beta oxidation, release one more acetyl-CoA, and then in the next beta oxidation round, we introduce actually a double bond so that we again have 2 double bonds here. One being a trans double bond, trans delta 2 that we just introduced, and the other is the cis delta 4, which was originally between carbons 12 and 13. And what we have to do is we have to convert this. Okay. And in E. coli, for example, this can be done in one step. In mammals that are a little bit more complicated, it's actually a two-step process where first a reductase produces a trans delta 3 double bond, and then isomerase produces a trans delta 2 double bond. But we have to convert these fatty acids into intermediates that can be recognized by the enzymes of beta oxidation. Okay, so we always have some isomerization reactions. In this case, we also have to do a reduction, okay, because we have 2 double bonds and we only want one. Okay. Good. So let's take a look at the overall energetics. And remember what I told you, that in the beginning, when we started talking about lipid degradation, fats are very energy rich. Okay. So remember when we talked about glycolysis and utilization of glucose, for example, for energy production, especially under anaerobic conditions, it was just a net yield of 2 molecules of ATP. Okay? So if we look at degradation of what do we have here, stearic acid, which has 18 carbons, no double bonds, so it's a saturated fatty acid, we see that we actually get a total net yield with regard to ATP equivalence of 120, which is a lot. Okay. So what I want you to do is I want you to be able to calculate the net energy yield of fatty acids, at least saturated fatty acids, regardless of the lengths of these fatty acids. So you have to understand the underlying principles of how you calculate this. So we do this using oleic acid, stearic acid as an example. And we see that first we have to invest 2 ATP equivalents. Why? Told you that before. We have to activate the fatty acid. So here it says stearic acid, it doesn't say stearyl-CoA, okay? So if it says stearic acid, we first have to activate it, and we learned that this consumes 2 ATP equivalents. So we start out with a loss of 2 ATP equivalents. If we have 18 carbons, what you have to understand is if we have 18 carbons, how many acetyl-CoA units can we produce? Good at math, so how many?
9.
9, okay. So, meaning we produce 9 acetyl-CoAs. All these acetyl-CoAs can be channeled to the citric acid side. What you have to remember is that each of these produces 1 ATP equivalent, 3 NADH molecules, and 1 molecule of FADH2. Okay. So, we will learn in more detail what these molecules, NADH and FADH2, are actually worth with respect to ATP equivalent, but here I give you the numbers already. So we can assume that for each molecule of NADH under aerobic conditions when we have cellular respiration happen, each molecule of NADH is worth 2.5 molecules of ATP. Okay, we'll see why that is when we talk about oxidative phosphorylation. But each molecule of FADH2 is worth about 1.5 molecules of ATP. Okay. So we produce, in this case, for each acetyl-CoA, 3 ATPs directly. Okay, so we produce 9 ATPs. Here it's shown as GTPs. Remember, it doesn't matter. So we have 9 acetyl-CoAs. So we produce in the citric acid cycle for each of these 1 ATP equivalent. So we produce 9 ATP equivalents. Then for each of these acetyl-CoAs, we produce 3 NADH. Each of these is worth 2.5 ATP equivalents. We produce 9 acetyl-CoAs, so we have 27 NADH times 2.5 is 67.5. We produce 9 FADH2s in the citric acid cycle, right? Times 1.5 is 13.5. Okay. So this takes care of what happened to these acetyl-CoAs in the citric acid cycle. But then we had to produce these 9 acetyl-CoAs by going through beta oxidation. How often? 8 times. So, for each round through the beta oxidation, how many NADHs do we produce? How many FADH2s? 1 per round, or 8 total, exactly. Okay? So, we have 8 NADH molecules from the beta oxidation, times 2.5 is 20. 8 FADH2s from beta oxidation times 1.5 is 12. So if we add all this up and take off the 2 ATP equivalents that we had to invest in the activation process, we get 120. So if you have a different chain number, of course, this number is different. Okay, so I encourage you to think about this. I've always been doing this kind of calculation on exams also in this class, and students would come up with the weirdest formulas actually to calculate this. If I give them a certain carbon length, and they would say, yeah, but according to my formula, it's that much. And then I asked them, okay, can you explain what's happening? No. So try to understand what's happening actually, and then it's really pretty straightforward. If you want to come up with a formula, do it. It's a multiple choice test. In the past, when I didn't have multiple choice tests in this class, I would actually ask, okay, what are the enzymes in the citric acid cycle that produce these electron carriers? Okay, because I wanted to understand how it's all related. So don't just be so narrow-minded and come up with a simple formula. Try to understand where this energy actually comes from. And then it's in my opinion, it's even easier. Okay, so since we produce so much energy, obviously energy production via lipid catabolism, fatty acid beta oxidation has also been tightly regulated, and that's something that I believe I mentioned at the very beginning of this class. I may or may not have mentioned this, that fatty acid degradation or beta oxidation of fatty acids is the opposing reaction or pathway to fatty acid biosynthesis as it occurs in the cytosol. So fatty acid biosynthesis occurs in the cytosol, and in the mitochondrial matrix we have beta oxidation happen. Okay, so it usually doesn't make sense to have both these opposing pathways occur at the same time. In few situations, it may make sense to produce heat. Okay, but usually we don't want this to happen necessarily. So we have to regulate these accordingly. And one important factor, the most important factor, is to just keep the fatty acids where they are supposed to be at a certain time, where we have a certain energetic state of ourselves. So if we are in an energy sufficient state, if we can afford, let's say, to not utilize these fatty acids, or actually different. Okay, let me rephrase this. If we need fatty acids, we don't have enough fatty acids. Okay, we don't transport fatty acids for degradation to the mitochondrial matrix, but at that time we probably have to synthesize them in the cytosol.
And the first intermediate in the synthesis of fatty acids is actually a molecule called malonyl-CoA. So we know now what malonyl-CoA looks like. Okay, it's a 3-carbon dicarboxylic acid linked to coenzyme A, and that's the first intermediate in the synthesis of fatty acids. So if our cells know that they rather have to synthesize fatty acids than degrade them, they produce malonyl-CoA. And malonyl-CoA actually inhibits carnitine acyltransferase 1, and with this, the transport of fatty acids across the inner mitochondrial membrane. So if the fatty acids are not transported to the mitochondrial matrix, they're not degraded in beta oxidation. Okay. So if the cell synthesizes fatty acids, it usually doesn't break them down. Okay. So this is probably the most important factor. But then also the beta-hydroxyl-CoA dehydrogenase that introduces our ketone beta-carbon is inhibited if we have a high concentration of NADH, and then we have a lot of energy. And then the acyltransferase thiolase, the acyl-CoA acyltransferase that cleaves off our acetyl-CoA is actually inhibited by high concentrations of acetyl-CoA, and we will see actually that this enzyme, especially in the liver, if we have elevated concentrations of acetyl-CoA, catalyzes the reverse reaction, okay, and fuses 2 carbon units to produce actually different structures. We probably won't have time to talk about this today. Okay, so I told you that in reality, fatty acid degradation is a bit more complex. Okay, so we usually in classrooms and in textbooks focus on beta oxidation as it occurs in the mitochondrial matrix, and that's good and fine, but that's not the whole truth, because especially longer chain fatty acids, polyunsaturated fatty acids, branched chain fatty acids, and also prostaglandins are degraded, or at least degradation starts in peroxisomes. Okay, and then we also have certain degradative reactions occur in the endoplasmic reticulum, but I'm not going to talk about this. But if we look at what happens in peroxisomes, overall, the type of chemistry is pretty much the same, and we also refer to these processes as beta oxidation, because we introduce, just as in mitochondrial beta oxidation, a ketone at the beta carbon, and then we cleave off acetyl-CoA. The enzymes that do that, however, are different. Okay, so here are the enzymes that we just discussed for mitochondrial beta oxidation, and here are the corresponding peroxisomal enzymes. There are a couple of differences. For example, here we have a multifunctional enzyme that contains the hydratase and our dehydrogenase. Here we would say second dehydrogenase. The specificity of the thiolase is a little different. It actually is active if we have fatty acids that are longer than 8 carbons long. But the difference is actually start in a way with the first reaction. Remember, that's the one that introduces our trans double bond here. As we just discussed in the mitochondrial beta oxidation, it's achieved by this dehydrogenase that produces FADH2, and they showed you that this FADH2, the electrons associated with this FADH2 can be channeled into the electron transport chain, and then can be utilized for ATP production in mitochondria. It's different here in peroxisomal beta oxidation to a certain extent. We also have a flavoprotein here, this oxidase, which produces FADH2, but then the FADH2 is actually reoxidized by not just removing the electrons and transporting them through the electron transport chain as it happens in the mitochondria, but we actually produce in this oxidase reaction hydrogen peroxide. Okay, so the oxidation happens with the help of molecular oxygen, and our protons and our electrons are actually transferred here to oxygen to produce hydrogen peroxide. Okay, so the energy here in our FADH2 is actually lost. You may know that hydrogen peroxide is toxic, it's cytotoxic, but it's in peroxisomes actually basically immediately cleaved to the harmless molecules water and oxygen with the help of an enzyme called catalase, very active enzyme. So we have produced the same intermediate in both mitochondrial beta oxidation and peroxisomal beta oxidation, which we now have to hydrate. Okay, now we have this inyl-CoA hydratase in mitochondrial beta oxidation. Here, the corresponding hydratase is part of a multifunctional enzyme. Doesn't matter, we introduce a hydroxyl group here, the beta carbon, which has to be oxidized next. So we have heard this is done with a dehydrogenase here that produces NADH in mitochondria. Actually, it's also done by peroxisomal dehydrogenase that also produces NADH, and presumably this NADH is actually transported out of peroxisomes and can be utilized then for energy production, other processes. Okay. Fact is, we have introduced a double bond beta carbonyl in the beta position, and we cleave off acetyl-CoA with the help of an appropriate thiolase. As I said, the peroxisomal thiolase actually has a different specificity compared to the mitochondrial thiolase, and it's active above 8 carbons. Okay, I would suggest that we continue with ketone body production next time. This is related to fatty acid degradation. Okay, that's probably we discuss it in this context. Okay, I see you.